When will I be good enough to be all I wanna be? When will I be good enough to live my life and be free? When will I dance till the morning lights up my day?
I'm very delighted to be here in the home of Dr. Allan Schore in California, and very honored to be given the time to have an interview with you, because I realize you're an extremely busy man moving around the world at a fair old rate of knots. So thank you for giving us this chance.
My pleasure, David. These are important matters to speak of.
Now, when I look at you, I see someone very centered, very calm, and a warmth emanating from you. I'm very relaxed in your presence. The first time I met you was probably about 8 months ago, roughly 9 months ago.
That's right.
Welcomed us into your home,
Right.
me and Julie, my colleague and co-founder, and instantly felt the same. So that's what I see, that's who I see sitting in front of me, that's the energy I get from you. And that, for someone in your position in the world of trauma, is great for me, because I instantly feel comfortable with you. Can you explain why your life has been focused, certainly your career, on trauma, and why that's happened?
Well, again, originally my training was as a psychotherapist, so clearly the matter of trauma, of psychological stress, is something that I have been looking at for some 4 decades. But I'm also a scientist. Essentially, I'm a clinician scientist, first a clinician and a scientist. So all of my theories have been more than just pieces of technical science. My work really has been in developmental neuroscience. My work is really in the origins of the human condition. And why these early origins leave such an indelible imprint on our personalities through the rest of our lifespan. And essentially about 2 decades ago, I became interested in integrating neuroscience with developmental psychology with infancy, and especially the attachment relationship. And so for now 2 decades, I've been interested in how social relationships impact the development of the human brain, especially in the early attachment relationship between the parents, between the mother especially, and the infant. And again, the idea that these early relationships are not just impacting us psychologically, but are shaping the brain through the emotional interactions. And at the core, trauma is not so much about cognitions, it's about emotions, and it's about extremely difficult emotions, emotions that are so overwhelming that literally, in many instances, they have to be shut away from consciousness. So very quickly, first of all, I became interested in normal development and how the loving relationship between the caregiver and the baby are shaping the brain, specifically the right brain, because before, it's not until the 2nd year of life that the verbal left brain comes on. But my interest has been from the beginning on the emotional brain, the social brain, the brain which we use to interact with other human beings, to literally guide our way in social interactions. And essentially the idea is that the first relationship, the relationship between the mother and the infant, again, shapes up this social brain for the rest of the lifespan. Now, as it turns out, there has been a shift in paradigms in the last 20 years. We are now moving into the centrality of emotion and into the centrality of interconnected social relationships.
Yeah.
And that really, that has been my greatest interest, how relationships not only alter the brain, but how relationships alter for better or worse, our brains, and especially this right brain, which is dominant for not only for emotional relationships, but also dominant for regulating stress. And again, trauma is difficulties in regulating stress. So somewhere along the line, after I began to think about how the loving relationship positively impacts the brain, I also then began to think about instances in which a less than optimal early beginning for an infant would also shape the brain in another way. There was no theory of trauma in psychology until the late 90s. The field had kind of banished it for an entire century. This was not only psychoanalysis, but all psychology, really. This was too dark a place to understand.
Why was that?
I think in part it had to do with the culture and the culture's, difficulties with dealing with real struggle, with real pain, with the darker sides of life, etc. And so, plus, you really needed certain advances in science, especially the brain sciences, to really understand what trauma was about. And you really need to have a deeper understanding of emotions, because again, trauma is about intense negative emotion. So it wasn't until these evolved that then we could translate that, into a better understanding of the origins of trauma and also the treatment of trauma.
When you talk about the darker side of life, you're talking about abuse, neglect in early childhood?
Yes, I'm talking about, the unfortunate circumstances of a child who does not have access to a caregiver who emotionally can resonate and can regulate feelings, etc. And again, remember that the attachment relationship is not just about the psychology, it's also actually wiring the brain here. And very specifically, when I put forth the early theories of trauma, these were about cases of abuse and neglect. That being the case, we now know that even cases less than those early severe beginnings also are impacting the brain. But yes, abuse and neglect. And just for the record, between abuse and neglect, neglect is more problematic to brain development and is less reported. And I think there's even more of a suppression about neglect than there is about abuse.
Do you think the general public are aware of how impactful those early times are?
I think perhaps intuitively, but I think that more information needs to get out. Yeah. As you see on a daily basis, you're seeing translations of neuroscience into behavior. I mean, on a daily basis, yeah. Whether it has to do with addictions or or trauma, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth of it is, much of this has not gotten out, and part of the reason I think also is because these mechanisms of trauma and of the ability to suppress trauma, the defenses against trauma, dissociation, etc., are working at levels beneath conscious awareness.
Yes.
And most of the focus again is on the conscious mind, etc. And yet the dysregulation, the problem here, is in the unconscious itself. Yeah. And the unconscious, which I'm suggesting is located in the right brain, the biological substrate of the unconscious, the right brain is also more connected into the body. The left speaking hemisphere, the left hemisphere is not as well connected into the body. So there has been an overemphasis on verbal language, and there has been an underemphasis on the bodily based aspects of the right brain. And again, trauma and stress and negative emotion are all located in the right brain, not the left brain. And there is another resistance to talking about the unconscious, because there's this illusion that we all have that our conscious mind is really what leads us through life, etc. And as you're well aware of, part of the coming to grips with trauma is letting go of the conscious mind, so to speak, and its grip and its hold. That literally keeps us away from the secrets that are held in the right hemisphere that the left hemisphere, has no idea about. Wow. And yet the body knows.
Yeah, this is music to my ears, I have to say. It's so fascinating. It's so wonderful to hear it. It's so wonderful to hear it because I've been living it. As you know, we've just been talking prior to the interview about my own journey through trauma and my own personal experiences. And so to hear you speak, I'm like, thank you. Thank you. And it's bringing, for us as an organization, bringing together all you pioneers you guys that really have done the work and that understand and can show how the brain is affected by early developmental trauma, and making the tools available for every man, woman and child, as I said to you earlier, to have access to the experiences and the funding and the education and the awareness that they need to be able to then go and do something about it. It's like, for me, what was such a revelation was that, wow, my unconscious is running the show. And I wasn't aware of my unconscious. I wasn't aware of it. I mean, I wasn't aware of my trauma, as you know, until 4 years ago. My father died, and then I found out. And the body memories came back first. So as my mother has said, well, hasn't this been put in your head by the therapist or the practitioners? And I'm saying, Mum, I was devoted to you, you and Dad. I was devoted to you, you know that. I'm not doing any of this to besmirch the family name. This is, you have to have lived it to have known. And things, first, for me, it was all coming from this body place. So the body was, remember, it was going back into positions that I was in when the abuse was happening. So there it was, my body was going, and I was doing a thing called the Hoffman process, which is a psychotherapeutic process which takes you back into those very early years. It's available in about 14 countries in the world, and it was phenomenal, and the practitioners on it were very, very skilled. But the lady that I particularly worked with, as I went into that, and I went outside of it, I cowered under the piano, this grand piano, and I went and I cowered in this fetal position, because the way they were leading us all in as a group, there was about 28 of us doing it, was that they get you into, they, for want of a better word, take you back, regress you, whatever you want to call it, to this early state. And it was all coming, I was writing all this stuff down, this rage, this anger, this fury, like I was bashing it all out. It was huge, and cowering under the piano, I couldn't take it any longer. And she said, "What do you need to do, David?" I said, "Go outside." So we went outside in a location in southern England, and I just laid, she said, "Do what your body needs to do." I lay down on the floor, and I said to her at the time, I said, "I've got this awful feeling that I've been abused." And she said to me, "David, I am 99.9% sure that's the case, because I've also been abused, and I recognize what the body is doing." And then 24, 48 hours after that, memories started, cognitive memories started to return. And it's taken a while for these memories. And I've done a lot of work, I've done EMDR work, somatic experiencing work, which I know you're a friend of Peter Levine, aren't you? It's part of your pioneer group. And, body is, body, it was coming from the body. And so, but to hold that note as an individual, and over the last 4 years to do all the work around the world and to find the practitioners I needed, which has been sensational in itself as a journey, but they've all brought something unique to the table for me. They've all brought a unique part of my own healing. So what fascinates me is your ART therapy. Could you explain a little bit about ART, affect regulation therapy, and how that's developed?
Right. Well, essentially what we're looking at in trauma, again, the major stress regulating networks, and trauma is again about the dysregulation of the stress response and about intense negative emotions, fear, terror, etc. So essentially my work for years has been focused on regulation. And just as the outcome of the early attachment is the communication of emotions, positive and negative, and then the interactive regulation of emotions through a relationship with another human being, well, I'm now seeing that the key to the work with trauma is not so much insight as it is the ability to be able to communicate these emotional states, to feel them in the body, to communicate these to another human being, and then for them to be regulated. Because essentially the origins of trauma are in relationships, and therefore the outcome of working with the trauma, again, has to be a relational outcome, number one. Number two, and this gets back to your earlier question about why it has been stayed in the dark for so long. One emotion which is overlooked, which I've written quite a bit about, that always accompanies trauma, as you're well aware of, is the emotion of shame. And the emotion of shame essentially is literally to hide. And it's to hide not only the self from others, but to hide from even from one's own self, etc. So a big part of any work with trauma has to be able to loosen up the boundaries and the bondedness, so to speak, the constriction of shame and understanding of shame. And that's tricky work. That's tricky work. Because there are times literally when we disengage and this hiding mechanism, you know, goes into play. And incidentally, I'm also interested in dissociation, in which we're cut off from the body. Yes. We're cut off from emotions and cut off from the body, which means that you have to understand the defenses against trauma as well as the trauma. So these are also elements now of regulation therapy, whereby it's the relationship really that does the healing, and that is co-created, that does the healing. And then the other part of that always accompanies trauma are the issues of safety and trust. And because obviously trauma interferes with a sense of safety with other human beings, everybody is now moving into emotions really being central. So this is not just my work. I mean, although I have been part of this, what has been called the emotional revolution, this was a talk that I gave to the American Psychological, but this is worldwide now, and so my lectures are literally worldwide also. But yes, I mean, I've been to Australia 4 times, but I've been to I'm guessing 30 countries in Europe, for the last 20 years over and over also. Emotions and the communication of emotions and then the regulation of emotions now is part of all therapies. And my interest is in what are the brain changes in all therapies. Now, the last part of that, when it gets to therapy, is it used to be thought that psychotherapy was about changing the mind and pharmacology was about changing the brain. We now see this is not the case. That psychotherapy that focuses on emotions also makes changes in the brain, especially in the right hemisphere, which regulates emotions, and therefore the right hemisphere really is a focus of all forms of trauma therapy, from body psychotherapy to other forms of therapy.
And do you believe that the brain can heal itself?
I think it can heal itself optimally when the brain is in interaction with another brain. The self can heal itself when it is open in interaction with another self.
That's beautiful.
And so this is the relational position that now also is throughout psychotherapy. But again, it's not another self who just intellectually understands. It's another self literally who can resonate with the feelings, who gives you a sense that this other person understands what I am feeling from the inside out.
That's it. From this connection.
Exactly.
Connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that connection is more than mind to mind, brain to brain. It's also body to body. We are always co-regulating our internal bodily states by our relationships.
Absolutely. Connection. I mean, that connection, for me, is the connection of love, and for our organization, giving and receiving is that exchange. So we put this at the center of the organization, of this exchange, these connections. So we're making these connections worldwide, these connections from heart to heart. And as you say, when the practitioner is coming from that space, and for me, what I see is that when they've experienced that themselves, then the connection comes, because they're all different forms of trauma, as we know, emotional, physical, you name it, there's all different aspects. But for me, when practitioners have experienced that themselves, they're coming from a real connection. Part of me was always trying to, over the last few years, was to really come to terms with the memories and the body memories, and how could I have lived all of those years in my family unit, having basically PTSD, having a breakdown 8 years ago because of the trauma levels, the vibrational levels of trauma. That's the way I see it within me, on high alert. So, I mean, I opened a care home. I've done that. I've cared for the elderly for 22 years. I built a beautiful home. I've had a great life, but there was this desolation, emptiness inside of me, and I couldn't understand why. So I dive in after the breakdown, and in to find out the answers. And some of those answers I didn't want to hear. I didn't want to hear this. I didn't want to know that. But I tell you, it's been my salvation to understand that and to meet people like you on this journey and to realize that actually the purpose of my life is actually to have experienced that suffering and that trauma so that I can offer back to others. And this is why I'm saying with the practitioners that our human nature, once we reveal the heart space and we take away the layers of protection that we've put there to try and protect ourselves from something that we thought, and as you say, then the body, my brain shut down for a very good reason, so that I could survive. And so I have to thank the brain and I have to thank my body for not unlocking anything any sooner, because there's always the right time for this healing to take place.
Right. These things are stored in the right brain and they're not stored in the left brain, etc. And although the first 2 years of life is a time when the right brain comes online before the speaking brain, and for the rest of the lifespan, the right brain really is central to, as I said, to emotions, to regulation. Empathy is central. There has to be some sense that the other empathically understands, what I am going through. There is plasticity in the right brain. And even though at the very beginning it is setting up its trajectory, at later points in time, we can opt into this plasticity, especially through a relationship. Not again through any pure detached self inside, but through a relationship. And so relationships can be healing for the rest of the lifespan. The other piece I want to talk about is that in the attachment relationship, which goes on for the rest of lifetime, our ability to attach with someone who is important to us and to use that person to share our emotions with positive and negative. I mean, the difficult ones, the stressful ones, but also the joy and the excitement. That is also there for the rest of the lifespan, again, in the right brain. But again here, the nature of the story is that we need this connectedness. And the other part of trauma is that it disconnects us. I mean, again, it disconnects us from others, it disconnects us from ourselves, etc. So in the end, one of the discoveries of attachment theory, of the early beginnings, is that the caregiver is not just down-regulating negative emotions, she's also up-regulating positive emotions. And trauma not only forestalls the ability to feel negative emotions and also empathy with someone else who is having negative emotions, which is what morality is about, to feel somebody else's pain if we're shut off from that. But it is also the capacity to feel excitement and to feel joy and to feel the vitality of life. And love is this aspect of down-regulating the negative, but also up-regulating the positive. And this really has been a major discovery, because we now know that positive emotions are absolutely essential for brain development over the lifespan.
But I recognize it because, just as you say, I didn't feel I deserved, because of the shame, I didn't feel I deserved a great life.
Exactly.
To love and to dance and to enjoy.
Exactly.
And it's only the last few weeks that I've really touched the deepest shame.
Yes.
To let that out, it's like, but the moment I do and I speak it, the spell is broken. Something changes. So for me, the whole medium of film that we're using to promote, to create a platform for us all, is one that can be so healing for the world. Having my voice heard in the world is a dream for me, and being able to speak truthfully about my experiences, not in any fear, just truthfully saying these are my experiences has been massively healing?
Trauma has an inhibiting effect on spontaneity, literally on being in the moment and of spontaneously allowing the self to express what it needs to say. It has a negative effect on authenticity, on literally allowing for the revelation of the true self rather than the socially compliant self, etc. And so these all have to do, as you say, with the inhibitions of shame dynamics. That again also must be worked through. The working through of the trauma is more than just working through of the intense negative emotions, the intense emotions that are literally overwhelming. It's also a matter of being able to work through these matters of shame. The other thing I want to point out is that the understanding of the origins of trauma, especially that its way that it's shaping the brain, which at later points will close down to human interactions, has meaning, as you pointed out, in terms of the change mechanism that is available at later points in time. And the change mechanism, psychotherapy is one of those mechanisms, but in the broader sense, the change mechanism again is interpersonal and relational. But there's another meaning to the work. The other meaning to the work is that, especially as we're looking at the early beginnings of human development being so important, is that I think we need to move earlier into early prevention. In other words, to give each individual the best possible chance at life, which means the best possible first 2 years, yes, where there are that there are smiling eyes, that there are others who are interested, that there are others who are emotionally resonant to the child's baby, that the baby can have the expectation when there's stress, a human being will be there. We really, in terms of the larger human situation or larger culture, we need to turn back to the needs of mothers and infants and to optimize that. The problem is that when it comes to mothers and infants, this is not a politically powerful group, and usually when programs are cut, here in the United States, as well as I'm assuming the UK, the first programs are for the very early, very young, and the very old, etc. And there's a relationship between the very early and then the very old. But we need to start put more of our resources into infants. We keep talking about the importance of our children, but really it's our infants, because so much of the brain is developing in infancy. We need to put more of our resources, our economic resources, and we now have the theory and we now have the techniques to be able to evaluate high-risk infants. We know this. And the work that is done in the first year of life can really reap tremendous rewards, at later points. So more and more now I'm talking about early intervention and prevention. In this country, in the United States, yes, it's not uncommon for mothers to go back into work at 6 weeks.
Okay. Yeah.
You don't have this in Europe. 6 weeks.
Not that soon after birth. Yeah. Usually I don't.
Which really doesn't allow enough time there for the bonding to occur and for the brain development to occur, et cetera. So I'm very concerned about matters. This period that has been the most mysterious period of all, and that is the period of the first 2 years of life. And I want to suggest that there is now significant advances in our knowledge about this period of the first 2 years of life, and that how this period also impacts directly on the problems we're going to be discussing here, but also to the matter of the ability for an individual to create a sense either of resilience or a predisposition to further psychiatric and medical disorders.
Do you believe that it has to be mother, or do you believe that other caregivers can come into that role?
I believe that there is a primary caregiver, mm-hmm, that essentially when the infant is under stress, it will go to one particular caregiver. I also believe that this caregiver originally is the mother, but then later there is this definite role for the father at a later point in time, because the attachment is first to the mother. The child's first relationship, the one with the mother, acts as a template as it permanently molds the individual's capacity to enter into all later emotional relationships. The real key is that the child has access to a right brain, to an emotionally sensitive, empathic, intuitive right brain, wherever that comes from. Okay. And again, I think we need to preserve that. And that has to be done at the level of policy and of national policy, and that this country needs to follow most all of the European nations who have set up programs whereby there is much longer maternal leave and paternal leave in the first year of life than we have here. Last month I was presenting this information to 1,000 judges and lawyers, who are working in family law. So more and more this information is getting out just beyond the mental health field and psychiatry and psychology into the larger culture. And I think it needs to go that way. So for me, who essentially started out on a one-to-one basis with patients, et cetera, my world is now expanding into the larger political agenda, and it's a necessary step to take.
What you say, Alan, for me, is that one of the most critical things is emotional resilience.
Right.
This resilience within us as individuals, and then resilience is created within society when we go within and create our own resilience.
And we make deep contact with others, because we can go deepest within when we're making deep contact with others who can hold us while we're moving into that space.
Yes.
Actually, underneath what we're talking about here are a different set of values. I mean, and again, I think we're looking at, there has been such an emphasis in Western civilization on achievement and on power dynamics, and essentially on, with our children, at least in this country, with just attempting to accelerating them into these left hemispheric, to be able to read and to write quicker and faster and taking tests. Meanwhile, what we have lost sight of are these other aspects of life, such as the arts, such as sports, such as music, etc. These are all. So what you're looking at is really there's too much of an emphasis on the left brain, and not enough on the right brain. And I think we're out of balance at this point in time, because again, this emotional resilience, connectivity is in the right brain. But I think we have kind of shortened literally this important period of life, which is the period of childhood. We've kind of shortened that now. And instead, we've put in too much emphasis in our children on this competition, on the matters, again, of achievement, et cetera. And I think we're out of balance about that. And even the educational systems really are I think, are off kilter on these matters. So there's been too much of a focus on each of us literally to be autonomous, to be individuals, and to have within us this capacity to overcome it all just by, digging deep within. But it's the connectedness and it's the relational that really is the key to this. And we've got to come back and bring this balance back up into more of these right brain activities. Again, creativity is right brain, much of morality is right brain, et cetera. And so, I think, again, we need to bring it back to balance.
Could you just briefly talk about the last 3 months of gestation in the womb and how that can affect our right brain and our...
Right. So the brain growth spurt, the time when the brain grows the most, when it doubles in size, is from the last trimester, which is the last 3 months of pregnancy, into the second year. And then, although there is brain growth, at later points, it's nothing like that. And that is also this period when the right brain is doubling over. This means that the periods right before pregnancy are also important in shaping the personality, in shaping a predisposition to either resilience or a predisposition to stress-regulated disorders. And we're now actually seeing that even physical diseases, cardiovascular disease, we're now thinking depression really have their sources in these early times.
We know a lot about the long-term, lifelong consequences of early life adversity, ranging from psychological effects like substance abuse and depression but also biological consequences like increased incidence of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and a whole host of other physical ailments.
So obviously something like drugs in utero is highly problematic. Nutrition needs to be there, in these early periods. And so there's more and more of a focus now on pregnant mothers and their physical and medical well-being as being critical. And then into the second year, again, we're looking at right around birth and again for the second year of life, it's the first year of life, that the essentially emotional well-being, which is at the core of it all, emotional well-being, literally the origins of it, again, are in this period from the last trimester to the second year.
So basically you're saying the emotional health of the mother affects the child.
Absolutely the case. So yes, and there is a lot of interest now, just for the record, in psychiatry, in the intergenerational transmission of either resilience or a predisposition to psychiatric disorders, because it's pretty clear now all the major psychiatric disorders, including the addictions, have their origins in these first 2 years.
Fascinating.
So that's where we need to literally put our efforts and
how could we work with mothers, pregnant mothers, and how could we work with that first early period of life to create the resilience that we're looking for?
Right. Just for the theory and actually the practical applications are already being worked out, because there are programs in this country as well as in the UK which are attachment-oriented programs, etc. And the key to those programs is not working just with the infant, it's working with the relationship. Again, see, it comes back to this, between the primary caregiver and the infant. And these programs are there. Plus, we also have a pretty good idea about how to assess high-risk situations.
We see her first as an abused, neglected child. She returns to court as a troubled adolescent, perhaps with substance abuse and mental health problems, engaging in risk-taking behavior. She is also abused by her partner and becomes pregnant. At each crucial developmental stage, we usually focus on changing her behaviors with little success. Can understanding the complex trauma that produces these behaviors change the result?
In the first 2 years, as I've said, the brain is sensitive to either positive or negative situations. And so if there is nutrition, or if there are nutritional deficits, or if there is too much stress or abuse and neglect, it will have a negative trajectory. And because you're talking about a critical period of growth of the right brain. But also in the first 2 years, there is more plasticity in the brain than in any later point in time. So this is literally where to put the money, so to speak, where there is more of this plasticity. And you can do more with that brain at 9 months than I think you can do with that same individual, let's say at 6 years. Okay, and my work, along with my wife Judith, is modern attachment theory, meaning neurobiologically informed attachment theory. Not to get too technical here, but there are differences between secure attachments and insecure attachments. So in an optimal situation with a good enough mother, this was a term that was used by the British pediatrician psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, actually.
Okay.
The good enough mother. She's not perfect.
Yeah.
But literally, and when she skips, when she misses, she's there to repair. The key to this is she's there to repair. In this kind of a situation, you're looking at, in an optimal situation, what's called a secure attachment. And a secure attachment is an indicator of later resilience, while an insecure attachment would be, something less than that. And in the most negative of insecure attachments would be associated with abuse and neglect. At the last quarter of the last century, the number of secure attachments was 70% in this country, 70%. Yeah. And then 30% were the insecures. In a recent study that was done in 2009 of 10,000 individuals, that 70% had dropped to 58%. You see, the number of secure attachments is dropping. And there is concern about this. Myself and my colleagues or actually have a book coming out, that what was there for decades, that was there to protect the mother-infant bonding situation, you know, families around it, etc. There were not not necessarily, you know, single individuals raising infants, etc. That the protections have been lost, etc. And also this idea about daycare, I think early daycare, also has exacerbated the problem because we know that early daycare increases the number of insecure avoidant attachments. Okay. And so as a result of that, just for the record, I'm now writing that there is an increase in psychiatric disorders today in the children in this country. And we need to curb that. And I'm suggesting that the reasons for that are because we have not protected this early phase of life, the mother-infant bonding and then the father, you know, bonding, etc. So again, we're paying for that. Remember, the attachment is an evolutionary mechanism. We're tampering with an evolutionary mechanism. So again, we need to focus back in this matter of preventions, you know, in the first 2 years.
They class you as the American Bowlby, John Bowlby.
Right.
Who is Dr. Allan Schore? Who are you on a much greater perspective? Yeah. Who is Allan Schore? What are you? Why are you here, Allan?
The purpose of the work and literally who I am is a match. Let me quickly put it this way. The reason why I've been called Bowlby is because I'm integrating biology and psychology. But to give you some sense of who I am, also is where I came from and my own early life. But before I wrote anything, I took 10 years off as a period of self-study. This was 10 years after I had my PhD.
Wow.
And my wife and I switched income responsibilities, and I just used all of that time for this self-study. There's a university near here, and I went to that university and brought back, you know, reams of studies, etc. I'm a full-time scholar, so I did that. And at the time when I was doing that, my friends were concerned, you know, why are you taking this path? And I just knew that I would follow this path because I was convinced that if I could put together the psychological and the biological, this would be a powerful theory, and that turned out to be the case. Number two, I told you I'm a clinician scientist. Upstairs are my clinical consulting rooms, my offices in this house. Okay. All of the work that I have created in science, although I have an appointment at UCLA at the medical school, all of that work has been created in this house, in the midst of the intimate relationships of myself and my family, which is why I have become very interested in intimate relationships, etc. So I never had the experience of being in a laboratory to create that. It has all come from the me who lives here, who was part of this space, and then the me, you know, who has created the ideas. Now, fortunately, for the first 20 years before there were computers to be able to do this. But right now in my offices, I mean, I have access in my computers to all of the libraries of the University of California, so I can continuously, you know, bring in the science and incorporate the science, you know, right here without actually having to be in laboratories. And actually, the research that I'm doing is with laboratories in Australia and in England. But again, the personal part of my life has been incorporated into the kinds of questions that I've asked, the kinds of questions that I've attempted to address.
So it's basically all been formed from the home, from your family unit.
In a very real way, in a very real way, absolutely.
Wow. And so, where did it come from, this 10 years that you spent? Where was that coming from where was it coming from within you? Like you say, your friends were concerned about you. What, 10 years to take this time?
Well, first of all, for the 10 years, the way that I've described it, I was under a Judy Schore Fellowship. I mean, all of the work that I have done has come from the income of our own private practices. I've never had, you know, grants, etc. Yeah. But essentially, where that all comes from is from my own early beginnings. I was very fortunate. My father was a chemical engineer. He was a scientist. He had a very, very curious mind. My mother was a gifted homemaker. This was in the late 40s and the 50s, etc. And at the same time, my father was a very warm man, and my mother, at the same time, was a very practical woman. So early on, my curiosity was something that they supported. On the one hand, there was a lot of love that was given to me, yet at the same time, they set certain limits which allowed my grandiosity to be bounded, so to speak. But it all stems in essentially to this curiosity and these connections. So the reason why I could do that for those 10 years was because my friend in a loving way were concerned about me. But behind it all, my parents, my wife's parents, and my wife literally were there, and they allowed me to go off onto this journey, to later come back at a later time. And that's the great sustenance that I get is from these relationships. The other thing I want to say is that when I wrote my first book, I was almost 50. And I think it's not unusual for biologists, because essentially I'm a biologist as well as psychologist, to do their work at later in life. I mean, physicists do it in their 20s. But I think it took a certain self-knowledge and a living of life and a living in relationships before I could write about the things that I wanted to write about, etc. And when the book came out, the first book came out, which will be the 20th anniversary soon.
Was that Affect Regulation?
And the Origin of the Self,
yeah.
Which was the first book written about the neurobiology of emotional development. Everything had been cognitive development. When the book came out, I was sure of the models. I was not sure that people would find as fascinating as I did these matters about how the mother and the infant literally were coming together in this loving way, etc. And it turned out that a lot of people were interested in that. But ultimately, it has led me around the world many times, and the other thing that has been a great surprise is one doesn't think that, when you're 50 and 60 years old, you're going to make new, strong friendships. And that's what happened. I have come across people around the world who have not only like minds, but like hearts. And I think you understand.
I do.
And I have forged connections with these people around the world, and this really has been a great bonus and a great joy. I didn't come into the trauma theory until about 9 or 10 years after.
Okay, so,
First,
so 59, 60.
This book came out in '94, and I wrote the trauma theory out about 2001. Okay. So all of it is an evolution, though. It's the same model as it deepens and then it deepens. And that essentially, in some ways, when I wrote the book, I knew that I was about 15 years ahead of science. But ultimately, science has caught up on it.
And so, I mean, when is the latest book coming out? Is that?
Well, this last book, The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy.
Yes, that's the 2012.
That's the last book. Yeah, that's the 2012 book. Yeah. So there are 4 books now, as well as hundreds of articles. But there are those 4 books: 94, 2003, 2012. Essentially, for whatever reason it means, every 10 years, I've accumulated enough information, enough knowledge to move forward. So every 10 years I put these books out, and I'm not sure where I'll go next. I have to make a decision about whether I want to go more into the clinical or more into the scientific, and now I've got another diversion here, the political.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
But life is good.
So okay, I'd love to ask you now, what is your vision? What is your vision for the future? So what is your greatest dream for the future?
Well, I mean, I look at that through the age at which I am right now. Mm-hmm. And, at this point in time, just for the record, I'm doing a lot of mentoring. Mm-hmm. So the people who are coming up behind me, they're not only being able to practice, but to teach and to write, etc. So I'm looking forward, and as I'm looking forward, what I'm looking forward is literally the next generations of psychotherapists, the members of our cultures, and literally how we can make you know, a better life and a better world for what is to come. I mean, I'm a grandfather, so this has, you know, a very real meaning to me, etc. But now, despite the difficulties in the world at this point in time, despite the economic and the political uncertainties, there is a very positive energy here because a lot of people are getting on board here.
The world has a lot to thank your parents and your family for, because you've affected great change already, and I'm so excited about the future of all that is. So thank your family. I thank your family in the world. Thanks your family for all that they've done and for you being here. And I bless you, and I'm just so honored to be here and part of this wonderful journey. So
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure, and I also wish you the best on your important work also.
so thank you.